At 4:12 a.m., the North Pacific Ocean. The screens inside the USS Gerald R. Ford's Combat Information Center flicker, glitch, and instantly go completely black. No satellite uplink. No link 16. No radar. For the first time in 80 years, an American carrier strike group is flying entirely blind. The Russian Northern Fleet has just successfully triggered a massive electromagnetic and quantum jamming event, effectively deleting the United States Navy's billion-dollar digital godbrain. But what the Kremlin does not realize is that by turning off the network, they just woke up something much, much worse. We have talked extensively about the system of systems, how the United States uses network data to dominate the seas. But today, we are looking at the Pentagon's most highly classified contingency plan. Protocol Zero. What happens when the world's most advanced military is forced to fight analog? To understand the absolute terror of this scenario, you first have to understand what was just lost. American naval superiority is not about individual ships or massive cannons. It is about a cloud-based, integrated kill web where every unit shares data instantly. Think of the Aegis combat system and the Link 16 tactical data network as the central nervous system of the Western Alliance. It processes targeting data at synchronization speeds similar to high-frequency trading algorithms on Wall Street. When the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft is in the sky, it acts as a coordinating brain, tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously and keeping them stable in a unified picture that frontline fighters cannot create on their own. The side that controls the electromagnetic spectrum and processes data faster wins. Shooting is almost always the last resort. But now, that entire billion-dollar architecture is gone. The Russian electronic warfare strike, launched from a coordinated network of stealth destroyers and high-altitude platforms, has flooded the environment with weaponized white noise. The radar screens on the American ships are choking on flawless, manipulated data. In the Russian command centers, they believe they have just achieved the impossible. They assume that because they have killed the radio waves, they have killed the vision of the American fleet. They believe the United States is entirely dependent on its network, and without it, the fleet is just a collection of blind, helpless titanium targets floating in the freezing swells of the North Pacific. They expect panic. They expect emergency broadcasts. They expect the American carrier to reverse course and flee. But this is exactly where the Russian strategic calculation makes a fatal structural error. They are projecting their own operational weaknesses onto their adversary. The Russian military operates on a strictly centralized command structure. Every major tactical shift requires a green light from a desk in a city thousands of miles away. If a Russian destroyer loses communication with Moscow, it loses its ability to fight effectively. The United States Navy is not built like that. While adversaries rely on rigid instructions from command, the American naval doctrine relies on 80 years of decentralized scar tissue experience. Every captain on an Arleigh Burke class destroyer and every pilot in an F-35 is an independent node with sovereign authority to act. They do not need orders to execute a lethal counterstrike. This is the institutional memory advantage that cannot be reverse engineered overnight. You can jam a satellite and you can spoof a radar, but you cannot jam 80 years of analog survival instincts. As the digital fog descends over the carrier strike group, the illusion of vulnerability takes hold. The Russian commanders, eager to capitalize on the blackout, launched their first wave of aggression. A swarm of hypersonic anti-ship missiles, including the dreaded Mach 9 Zircon, is fired from Russian submarines and stealth cruisers lurking just over the horizon. In a normal scenario, the American network would have detected the launch signatures instantly, shared the coordinates across the cloud, and neutralized the threat before the missiles ever reached their terminal phase. But the network is down. The Russian commanders wait for the inevitable explosions, assuming the American fleet is defenseless without its overarching godbrain. But the United States Navy does not panic. They seamlessly transition to decentralized defense. The 12 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers surrounding the Ford immediately switch from centralized cloud control to localized, autonomous intercepts. These destroyers no longer need the Hawkeye to tell them what to do. Their individual Aegis baseline systems operate as sovereign fortresses. They switch their radar frequencies and rely on passive sensors to filter out the jamming, executing emergency protocols that every sailor has drilled into their muscle memory. The destroyers begin firing interceptors based solely on the raw, analog data gathered by their own isolated sensors. The Russian missiles, expecting to find a panicked and disorganized fleet, instead fly into a perfectly coordinated wall of localized defense. The American ships are no longer communicating through a high-tech data link, but they are operating with a unified purpose born from decades of rigorous, uninterrupted carrier operations across the globe. Every storm tracked, every sonar anomaly cataloged, and every electronic signature logged over the past 80 years has become part of a living database within the minds of the American commanders. They understand the rhythm of naval combat so intimately that they can anticipate the enemy's movements even when the screens are dark. The first wave of Russian missiles is swatted from the sky, not by a flawless artificial intelligence cloud, but by the raw discipline and autonomous capability of individual American warships. The Kremlin strategy of blinding the fleet has failed to produce the intended chaos. Instead, it has stripped away the digital safety net and unleashed the raw, predatory instincts of the world's most experienced naval force. The Russian commanders realize, with a growing sense of dread, that they are no longer fighting a predictable algorithm. They are fighting a decentralized organism that adapts and survives under the most extreme friction imaginable. This is the reality of the gray zone confrontation. The United States deliberately avoids kinetic escalation when possible, turning the opponent's aggression into a data collection goldmine. Even in the dark, the American systems that remain functional on a localized level are recording every electronic signature, every trajectory, and every behavioral pattern of the Russian attack. The Russian fleet is exposing its most classified tactics to an enemy that is absorbing the blows and preparing a devastating response. The blackout was meant to be the end of the American carrier, but it was actually just the beginning of a completely different kind of war. The Russian forces have exhausted their initial element of surprise and expended millions of dollars in advanced munitions, only to find the American fleet still holding its formation, silent and deadly in the freezing fog. The tension in the air is suffocating. The Russian captains know that the United States Navy will not simply absorb a strike and remain defensive forever. The counterattack is coming, and without the predictable parameters of the digital network, the Russian commanders have no idea what form it will take. The American fleet has vanished from the digital spectrum, but its physical presence is a terrifying reality that the Russian forces must now confront. Beneath the surface of the freezing ocean, the environment is just as hostile as the airspace above. Thick, low clouds obscure visibility on the surface, while beneath the waves, the cold air and icy sea make traditional acoustics incredibly unreliable. The ocean here is a layered battlefield of thermal gradients, where submarines can hide in the temperature shifts. The Russian Kilo-class submarines, known as black holes for their extreme stealth capabilities, are silently gliding through these disputed waters. They lie motionless just below the thermocline, waiting for the perfect moment to exploit the surface chaos. The Russian submarine commanders feel a false sense of absolute security. They believe that because the American surface network is blinded, the underwater domain belongs entirely to Moscow. They assume their multi-million-dollar vessels are invisible in the abyss, fully protected by the natural noise of the turbulent sea and the electronic warfare storm raging above. But this assumption is just as flawed as the belief that the surface fleet would crumble without its network. The American underwater defense does not rely solely on the digital uplink to the carrier. It relies on localized, highly autonomous systems and the unmatched acoustic superiority of its attack submarines. The USS Delaware, a Virginia-class nuclear attack submarine, has been operating in ultra-quiet mode beneath the Russian formation for hours. It does not need the Link 16 network to know exactly where the enemy is hiding. It relies on the raw, physical acoustics of the ocean, processing the microscopic deviations in the water current and the harmonic heartbeat of the Russian engines. The Delaware is a silent predator, completely unaffected by the electromagnetic chaos on the surface. The Russian submarines, while stealthy, are operating under a centralized doctrine that makes their movements rigid and predictable. The American submarine, operating with full autonomy, is already mapping the escape routes and calculating the exact moment to strike. The digital blackout has not hindered the American underwater forces. It has simply untethered them from the constraints of the broader network, allowing them to hunt with terrifying independence. The illusion of vulnerability is complete. The Russian forces, both above and below the water, have played their opening moves based on a fundamental misunderstanding of American naval power. They have attacked the network, believing it to be the source of the American strength. But the true strength lies in the institutional discipline, the decentralized command structure, and the analog survival instincts of the individual units. The Russian Kilo-class submarines, lurking beneath the thermocline, assume their stealth is absolute. They rely on the ocean's natural noise and thermal layers to mask their acoustic signatures, believing the blinded American surface fleet is entirely focused on the aerial missile swarm. The Russian doctrine dictates that without the digital kill web to coordinate anti-submarine warfare aircraft and process complex sonar buoys, the American destroyers are effectively deaf to the threats below. But they are failing to comprehend the sheer physical brutality of American analog contingency plans. The United States Navy does not need a flawlessly functioning Link 16 network to hunt in the dark. When advanced algorithms and digital sonar processing are taken off the board by electronic warfare, the American commanders simply bypass the digital spectrum entirely and weaponize the raw physics of the ocean. The order is given not through a highly encrypted cloud network, but through localized line-of-sight communication. A squadron of F divided by a -18E and F Super Hornets, having launched from the deck of the Gerald R forward before the jamming reached its peak, are instructed to execute a maneuver that is not found in any standard modern anti-submarine warfare manual. It is an extreme physical countermeasure. The Super Hornets drop from their high-altitude patrol patterns, descending rapidly through the freezing fog until they are skimming just feet above the violent swells of the North Pacific. They ignite their afterburners, accelerating past the speed of sound directly over the suspected coordinates of the Russian black hole submarines. The result is a series of catastrophic sonic booms. These are not electronic signals or spoofed radar ghosts. They are massive, localized pressure waves generated by the sheer physical force of the supersonic aircraft displacing the atmosphere. When these shock waves hit the surface of the ocean, the kinetic energy does not simply dissipate. It acts like a massive acoustic hammer, pounding the water and propagating downward through the thermal layers with terrifying violence. For the Russian crew inside the Kilo-class submarine, sitting at a depth of 150 feet, the silent ocean is instantly transformed into a deafening iron cage. The pressure waves slam against the titanium hull, bypassing all stealth coatings and electronic countermeasures. The Russian passive sonars, highly sensitive instruments designed to listen for the faint hum of distant propellers, are instantly blinded by the overwhelming acoustic overload. The operators tear off their headsets in agony as the screens fill with pure, unadulterated noise. Inside the submarine, the psychological terror is absolute. The crew cannot communicate. They cannot track the American surface ships, and they cannot determine if they are under direct kinetic attack from depth charges or torpedoes. The sudden, violent increase in sound pressure strips away their situational awareness, replacing their calculated stealth with blind panic. Unable to withstand the acoustic torture and fearing a hull breach for what sounds like a relentless bombardment, the Russian submarine commander is forced to make a humiliating decision. He orders an emergency blow of the ballast tanks. The Russian submarine surges upward, breaking the freezing surface of the Pacific in a violent eruption of foam and displaced water. They have escaped the sonic torment of the deep, but they have surfaced into a nightmare. They are not greeted by a chaotic, fleeing American fleet. Instead, an MH-60 or Seahawk helicopter is already hovering directly above their sail, its weapons systems locked onto the exposed hull. The United States Navy did not need a digital network to find a Russian submarine. They simply used the physical environment to violently expel it from the shadows. The Russian crew realizes that their multi-million-dollar stealth platform has been defeated by the raw, analog application of atmospheric pressure. But the Russian strategic offensive is not limited to missiles and submarines. While the surface fleet is engaged with the hypersonic swarm and the Super Hornets are pounding the ocean's surface, a secondary, far more insidious threat is unfolding. The Kremlin understands that the USS Gerald R is a floating fortress, heavily armored and defended by overlapping rings of localized interceptors. Sinking it from the outside, even with the network down, is proving nearly impossible. Therefore, the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, has initiated a shadow operation designed to decapitate the carrier from within. They are exploiting the chaos of the electronic warfare blackout to insert a human element directly into the heart of the American flagship. As the carrier maneuvers violently to evade the incoming threats, a highly specialized team of elite Russian commandos utilizes autonomous underwater delivery vehicles to approach the massive hull of the Ford. These operatives are wearing liquid oxygen stealth suits, meticulously designed to mask their thermal signatures against the freezing temperatures of the Arctic water. Using high-frequency magnetic resonance tools, they silently scale the titanium armor of the ship, bypassing the outer physical security perimeter. Their objective is not to engage in a prolonged firefight with American Marines. Their objective is to breach the lower decks, access the localized server racks, and plant physical logic bombs and explosive charges directly onto the isolated nodes of the Aegis combat system. If they cannot blind the ship digitally from afar, they will lobotomize it physically from within. The Russian commandos believe they have successfully slipped through the cracks of the chaotic analog defense. They breach an external hatch and enter the labyrinthine corridors of the carrier's lower levels. They move with absolute precision, assuming that the American security forces are entirely focused on the external missile threat and the catastrophic failure of their primary radar networks. But they have made a fatal miscalculation regarding the layered depth of American contingency planning. The United States Navy assumes that the hull will eventually be breached. The internal security of a Ford-class carrier does not rely solely on digital cameras or networked alarm systems. It relies on localized, autonomous environmental sensors that measure microscopic fluctuations in atmospheric pressure and ambient temperature. The moment the heavy steel hatch is breached, the localized internal sensors detect the anomaly. However, no sirens wail. No flashing red lights illuminate the corridors. The American Command Center, operating on backup analog systems, initiates a ghost containment protocol. They deliberately allow the Russian commandos to proceed deeper into the ship, silently tracking their progress through the mechanical closing of automated bulkheads behind them. The Russian team is being herded, guided through a series of reinforced corridors that have been pre-designated as internal kill boxes. They believe they're infiltrating the central nervous system of the ship, but they are actually walking directly into a billion-dollar steel trap. As the commandos reach their target junction, the heavy blast doors at both ends of the corridor simultaneously slam shut, locking into place with tons of hydraulic force. The Russian operatives immediately raise their weapons, expecting an ambush by heavily armed naval security personnel. But the corridor remains completely empty. The United States Navy has no intention of risking American lives in a close-quarters firefight inside the ship's vital infrastructure. Instead, they deploy a weapon that requires no network, no kinetic projectiles, and leaves no physical damage to the surrounding equipment. They activate localized high-intensity infrasound emitters embedded within the walls of the containment zone. These emitters do not project audible noise. They project low-frequency acoustic waves that resonate at the exact frequency of the human inner ear and internal organs. The effect on the Russian commandos is instantaneous and devastating. The infrasound waves pass directly through their tactical gear and helmets, causing violent, uncontrollable vertigo. Their vision blurs, their balance evaporates, and a crushing sense of nausea drives them to the steel deck. They are completely incapacitated within seconds, unable to stand, aim their weapons, or even comprehend the nature of the attack. Without firing a single bullet, and without relying on a single network camera, the American internal defense systems have neutralized the elite Russian strike team. This is the brutal reality of fighting the United States Navy when the screens go black. The Russian military engineered an electronic apocalypse, assuming that the American forces would be paralyzed without their digital godbrain. Instead, they stripped away the sophisticated rules of engagement and the highly calibrated restraint that the network enforces. They forced the Americans to resort to raw physics, acoustic hammers, and infrasound torture. The Russian offensive is unraveling not because the American network was quickly rebooted, but because the analog, localized defenses of the fleet are fundamentally designed to turn the enemy's aggression into a humiliating defeat. With the internal boarding party completely incapacitated by localized infrasound and their stealth submarine forced to the surface by the sheer atmospheric pressure of supersonic aircraft, the Russian Northern Fleet's masterstroke has entirely stalled. The Kremlin engineered this massive electronic blackout under the assumption that the American carrier strike group was a fragile, tech-dependent entity that would instantly crumble without its digital uplink. They expected a paralyzed fleet, frantic radio calls, and a hasty, humiliating retreat. Instead, they have provoked a decentralized, highly autonomous war machine that is currently dismantling their offensive using raw physics and terrifying restraint. The American forces have not fired a single kinetic warhead, yet the Russian tactical position is disintegrating in real time. This brings us to the most critical failure in the Russian strategic calculation. They fundamentally misunderstood the difference between a military that uses a network and a military that is entirely dependent on one. In Moscow, the silence from their elite strike teams and their submarine commanders is deafening. The Russian military doctrine is strictly centralized, meaning that every major tactical shift, every authorized launch, and every withdrawal requires a green light from a desk in a command center thousands of miles away. But by deploying a massive electromagnetic jamming field to blind the Americans, the Russian fleet has inadvertently severed its own tactical communications. The Russian captains on the front line are now isolated in the dark, paralyzed by indecision because their doctrine does not empower them to act independently. They're waiting for orders that cannot reach them. The United States Navy operates on the exact opposite principle. While the Aegis combat system and the Link 16 network are the pinnacle of modern naval coordination, they are ultimately just tools layered over a foundation of commander's intent. When the screens go black, American commanders do not wait for a satellite transmission from the Pentagon to tell them how to survive. Every captain on an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, every submarine commander, and every pilot is an independent node endowed with the sovereign authority to execute lethal force to protect the fleet. They rely on 80 years of continuous, decentralized scar tissue experience. Every storm tracked in the North Atlantic, every sonar anomaly cataloged in the Pacific, and every electronic signature log during the Cold War has been absorbed into the institutional memory of the Navy. This is a living database that resides not in a vulnerable server rack, but in the minds and muscle memory of the American sailors. You can replicate a hypersonic missile, and you can even replicate stealth geometry, but you cannot reverse engineer 8 decades of autonomous analog survival instincts. As the Russian surface commanders desperately try to regain control of their unraveling operation, the United States Navy prepares to deliver the final psychological death blow. The American commanders understand that in the gray zone of modern warfare, sinking a Russian destroyer would trigger a catastrophic geopolitical shockwave, potentially drawing NATO and Russia into an irreversible global conflict. The objective is not to destroy the Russian fleet kinetically, but to break their operational will completely. The United States must prove to the Kremlin that even when the American network is dead, the Russian fleet is still entirely at their mercy. The Russian flagship, heavily shielded and operating under the assumption that it is safely hidden within its own electronic warfare fog, is suddenly targeted by an invisible predator. The USS Delaware, a nuclear-powered Virginia-class attack submarine, has been silently tracking the Russian command vessel since the blackout began. The American submarine does not need a digital data link to find the enemy flagship. It simply followed the massive acoustic and electronic wake generated by the Russian jamming equipment. The Delaware slides silently through the freezing water, executing a textbook shadowing maneuver until it is positioned directly beneath the keel of the Russian flagship, at a depth of just 60 feet. For the Russian admiral standing on the bridge, the illusion of safety is absolute. He believes he is the apex predator of the blinded ocean. Then, the ocean itself delivers a terrifying warning. The USS Delaware does not launch a Mark 48 heavyweight torpedo. Instead, it drops an acoustic sledgehammer. The American submarine unleashes a massive, maximum power, mid-frequency active sonar pulse directly into the steel hull of the Russian flagship. Inside the Russian vessel, the sound is deafening. It reverberates through the steel corridors like a heavy wrecking ball striking an empty fuel tank. The entire Russian crew freezes in absolute terror. Every veteran sailor aboard knows exactly what that specific acoustic signature means. In modern naval warfare, hitting a surface ship from below with a point-blank active sonar ping is the ultimate psychological weapon. It is the acoustic equivalent of racking a shotgun directly behind someone's head in a pitch-black room. The message from the American submarine commander is brutally clear, and it requires no translation and no digital network to understand. We have a perfect firing solution. You're locked. A heavyweight torpedo is aimed directly at your engine room, and you're only alive right now because we are allowing it. The Russian admiral stands paralyzed on his bridge. His deep-sea stealth submarine has been forced to the surface by pressure waves. His elite internal strike team has been neutralized without a single gunshot. His hypersonic missiles were intercepted by autonomous, localized defenses. And now, an invisible nuclear predator has him dead to rights from below. He is completely out of moves. The game is over, and not a single American missile had to be fired to secure the victory. The Russian fleet immediately begins a controlled, humiliating withdrawal. They turn their vessels back toward their northern ports, limping away in the freezing fog. The Kremlin's multi-billion-dollar operation designed to blind and embarrass the United States Navy has ended in a complete strategic failure. By attempting to force the Americans to fight in the dark, Russia only succeeded in exposing its own tactical limitations and vulnerabilities. The American fleet remains in perfect formation, silently tracking the retreating Russian ships, absorbing every piece of analog data, and preparing for the moment the digital network comes back online. The ultimate takeaway from this geopolitical confrontation is a chilling reality check for any adversary attempting to challenge the United States at sea. Modern naval warfare is not simply about who has the best algorithms, the fastest missiles, or the most advanced quantum jamming equipment when everything works perfectly. It is about who has the institutional discipline, the decentralized command structure, and the raw physical resilience to remain highly lethal when the screens go black. Technology is a force multiplier, but the true foundation of American deterrence is the human element operating within a deeply ingrained system of autonomous survival. You can jam a satellite, and you can spoof a radar, but you cannot jam 80 years of analog survival instincts. The United States Navy does not just own the network, they own the dark.